One of the most exciting things for a curator, after going around the world and looking at all these things and getting them here, is getting them out of the box. And I thought I knew these pictures quite well, but getting them out, laying them down to inspect them with a good light, you find things you had no idea about. You find texture of the paint, you find different kinds of paint. And one of the things that's really astonishing is even in these early, quite thin works, there's a hell of a lot more paint than I thought, and quite often sand. I mean, there's one painting from the mid-50s where there's this figure which is almost transparent. You can see it's a figure from a distance, but when you get up close, it's hardly any paint there at all. But it's casting a shadow, and the shadow's been made using a really sticky oil paint with sand mixed into it. It's almost like a sculpture of a shadow. It's the most substantial thing in the painting. And there are other places where I thought we just had a flat black, where he's actually worked up glossy materials into the black. So you get a whole series of textures. They're quite different than I'd often thought, and much more going on. And of course, you know, I knew that the paint was applied in many different ways. But for example, the use of spray paint. You know, he's not doing graffiti with the spray paint, but he's using a light speckling of different colors, different tones, to produce the sensation of grit and sand later on in the show. Earlier on, it really is sand. And later on, it's kind of mixture of fluff and this spray paint, which produces the sensation of sand or gravel or something. So, yeah, when you get close up to them, and the great thing about the show is that Bacon always had everything put under glass. So, I mean, with a lot of exhibitions, you get within a meter of the thing and the guards shout at you. With this one, people can come up really close and inspect the works because it's quite safe to do so. And I hope people do just that. Well, the other thing is that, you know, you've done a plan and you know what the rooms are going to look like more or less. But sometimes you get them out of the box and start putting them around the wall. And you just want to group them slightly differently. You realize that actually these 5 works, for instance, from the mid-50s again, they actually make a beautiful sort of set, a suite of images which speak to each other. They're quite poetic. It becomes almost like one experience. And I didn't expect that, but that was great. Otherwise, I think, you know, most of the rooms look pretty much how I'd imagined them, but probably stronger than I'd expected. And my ploy of making it decade by decade, I think really paid off. I think people who are very familiar with Bacon retrospectives are seeing things for the first time they hadn't seen before, which is what I hope to do, and to keep a sense of texture changing throughout the exhibition. I think it does. The reason I wanted to do a Francis Bacon show is simply because I think he's certainly the most exciting painter of the 20th century. He uses paint like nobody else. You know, I mean, I think towards the end of his life, Richter would have been somebody who would be competition, but Richter's nothing like as complex as Bacon. But I'm looking up at that level, you know, of modern art. And I suppose what he says always is that he wants to get past the appearance of something, to actually destroy the illustration of the thing, to bring back the sensation of the thing directly onto the nervous system. So, and if you just make a picture that looks like something, it doesn't do that. So he breaks up that likeness, distorts it if you like, and uses the paint really vigorously and extraordinary different textures. I mean, the paint goes on with rollers, paintbrushes, thick paint, thin paint, dragging it across raw canvas so it builds up little ripples and rivers of paint. In one of them, he's used children's birthday cake candles, red ones, to make the curtains behind one of the popes. I mean, he's included dust, he's included sand. He's put paint on using corduroy trousers, you know, dabbing, so you get this kind of maybe a thick white paint for the face, and then across it, these red lines or something which give the flesh tone, but it's the impression of the cloth. And there are different cloths as well in different places. All of these things, and then the spray paint, you know, it's It's a tour de force of every possible technique known to man and several that aren't. And even letroset in places applied over the paint. We've been really lucky to get hold of 70 objects from the studio, gathered from the studio floor, where they were littered in piles, and chosen very particularly because they relate to works in the exhibition. And they're in a display case in the third room, which you can see just how chewed up and badly treated the photographs were. Sometimes splattered with paint, fingerprints on them. Sometimes they're really fragments. Sometimes they're folded and pinned together, glued down onto cardboard, whatever, you know. So there's an enormous range of things, and they come from pages torn from popular journals, from art history books, photographs that he commissioned himself, sporting photographs, you know, I mean, all kinds of things that he gathered and then used in the work. Not to copy or do directly, but sometimes 2 or 3 different images will come together, and in his mind, they transform into something else. So when he gets into the studio and starts to paint, there's a trace of all these things, and often you can see it. So people who are really interested in that kind of thing can go back to the display cases, and they will find the likenesses of people that they've seen on the wall in the paintings. And sometimes that's rather charming, actually, because when you see Michel Leiris, very distorted portrait in the painting, but the photograph of him shows you just how like Leiris he actually makes it. He captures the sensation of Leiris. I've just been marking like about 150 entries to ABC for a crit of the Michel Leiris portrait, where they've been doing in Brisbane, ABC. And many of them actually saw through to the sensitivity of Leiris, identified with him in some way. I mean, some people just saw distortion and kind of nauseating kind of unreality. But a lot of people, interestingly, identified strongly with the portrait, because it is actually a very tender thing. I mean, it's been distorted not beyond recognition, because you can immediately identify it with the photograph of Leiris. But you feel something about the tenderness that Bacon felt for the man, the kind of intelligence of Leiris. Yeah. And some people said, well, it looks like he's a surrealist, which of course he was. Not Bacon, Leiris. There have been some major retrospectives of Bacon, 3 in the Tate, you know, great one in '71 in the Grand Palais. They've been in America, in Russia. You know, he's had major retrospectives everywhere except Australia. But I thought, well, there's a certain similarity to a lot of them, and I really did want this one to be a bit different. I mean, why bother to do it again, you know? So first of all, arranging it by decade. I mean, the room I'm sitting in now, everything relates in some way to the Crucifixion series. Everything except the figure going through a curtain. But everything else does. And a lot of them have got this kind of open mouth. I've included a little snippet of film from the battleship Potemkin where the nurse is screaming as her eyes shot away, which he looked at very, very long and hard. So there's a relationship to that in this room. You go into the next room, and it's totally different. The style of painting and everything is different. In the 50s, it's very overall, very streaky, vertical streaks all over the place. The figures are dissolving into the field, you know, breaking up. Sometimes the figures are much less defined even than the field or the curtain that they're sitting in front of. You get to the end of that room and we turn into the 60s, and suddenly it changes completely again. And you see strong fields of color surrounding a tightly bunched up figure in the middle, which is where all the gestures, all the paint goes. It's a completely different way of painting than the 50s. So we've gone through the exhibition like this, and I think each room feels different. So that in itself is different from anything that's been done before. And the other thing I've tried to do, not so much in the hang of the exhibition, but in the catalogue, is to bring out aspects of Bacon's work which relate to the international avant-garde. I think nobody's quite liked to do that before. It's much easier to say Bacon's a one-off, he's an eccentric, he's one of those English painters, you know. He's not, he's a European, I'd say an international artist who fully understood the moves that were going on from Duchamp onwards. He was very committed to Duchamp's work, and nobody ever got him to explain why. So I've tried to do it for him. But I think it was very interesting in the process. And now seeing the works coming out of the crates and seeing them really close up, I'm convinced that that was right. It's interesting that Bacon, more often than anybody else, when he's talking, he refers to Marcel Duchamp as probably being the most important artist of the late 20th century, or the 20th century actually. And his interviewer, the art historian David Sylvester, got him to try and talk about Duchamp's famous work, The Large Glass, because Bacon puts everything under glass and it makes it difficult to look at because you have to dodge not to see your own reflection. Duchamp did it in his large glass because he wanted people to see their own reflection. He wanted people to see through it and then to see themselves reflected. A certain kind of complexity that involves the real world in the picture. David tried to get Francis to talk about that, and of course he's very perverse. A lot of artists do this to you. And he turned around and said, no, I just want to protect the painting. After Bacon's death, Sylvester did go back and write, looking back at Francis Bacon, and he articulated what he thought Francis was looking at. I didn't think it was so much the large glass, actually. I thought it was something else entirely. I thought it was the way he uses material traces. In other words, you know, he once did say in a letter to Leiris, I want to paint grass. I always try and capture grass. Sometimes I see grass and I want to pull the grass and the earth and put it in the frame. Then he says, of course, it wouldn't work. But, you know, if he was Joseph Beuys or if he was Anselm Kiefer, he would do exactly that. But it's that same impulse that they had to actually put the real thing in the painting, which he's talking about. And he always says he's a realist. And although I suppose generally a popular opinion of realism would mean that it looks like the thing, but actually there's another kind of realism which is about trying to capture the sense of the thing, and you might do that by having a trace, a fragment of the thing, a mark that's similar to the thing in some way, using the thing itself. I mean, if, you know, Kiefer actually puts mud in the painting, you know. Beuys uses materials that he finds, collects, some of them very obvious materials like felt and fat and so on that relate to his personal story, but where he allows the material to spin. Now, Duchamp invented that, really. I mean, people have done it for 500 years. I mean, I mention in the catalogue that actually Vermeer put sand into his painting of brickwork to create the grittiness of bricks. And Bacon does a lot of that, I can tell you. There's a lot of sand when you go around looking, particularly on the floor, the bull ring, and sometimes in the body as well, which has got nothing to do with flesh at all. It's just to make the brush marks stand up in another way. But all of those things, in some ways, that going for a real that isn't about making a picture of something, but capturing a sense of it through some association or affiliation with the thing itself. I've said that I think Francis Bacon's the most important painter in the 20th century, and he has very strong connections in Australia. His father was born in Adelaide. His grandmother, Lady Charlotte, also took Byron as a lover, and he wrote about her. She became Ianthe in his writing. She drove around Adelaide in a coach with Byron's coat of arms on the side, so she was kind of very open about that. So it started early, this kind of open sexuality in the Bacon clan, you know. Anyway, so there's that strong historical connection. When he went to London first, he's immediately picked up by the Australian painter Roy de Maistre. They lived together for a while. What sort of a relationship it was, we don't know exactly, but clearly he encouraged him to paint, because at that stage Bacon was doing furniture design, not painting. So de Maistre is a very important Australian modernist working in London then. He introduced him to Patrick White. Patrick White, who was in love with de Maistre but not getting anywhere, was very annoyed by Bacon's being there, this young teddy boy. He was quite derogatory about Francis, but nonetheless, he didn't like his lipstick, you know. But nonetheless, he actually commissioned a desk, a replica of which he had in Sydney when he came back here, a coffee table he bought off Bacon. So there's all those connections. Brett Whiteley often visited the studio. So if you look at Brett's paintings of Rillington Place, the Christie murders, the Bath murders, the figure on the stripy mattress and so on, and you go and look at the figure of Henrietta Morris in the show here, you can see exactly where Brett was getting it from. And in fact, Francis, when Brett showed him images of these paintings, Francis said, "Ah, I see you took from me as I took from Velázquez," which is true. So there's that long connection, and we've never had a show. That's crazy. So I think it's enormously important. And as I said, you know, you can look at Bacon books as much as you like. You won't see the textures. You won't see all the different ways of applying the paint. You won't feel the visceral presence of them. And the whole point of Bacon paintings is to create this kind of visceral presence that impacts on the sensibilities of the viewer. And that happens in front of the paint, not in front of a photograph of it. With great artists, people want to know what the legacy of the artist is. And often they mean, you know, who came along, who did similar work afterwards or took the work further in some way. And in that sense, anybody who tries to do Bacon is doomed to failure. It's just not possible. I don't know why. Well, it's so specific, technically so specific, subject matter so specific. But it's amazing how many artists, when you talk to them, his ideas, what he's actually done, this whole idea of using chance, for example, you know, actually one of Bacon's favorite things to say, I really want to kind of capture the image by chance, as it were. There's one quote from him here, ideally I'd like to throw a handful of paint at the canvas and have the portrait be there. I mean, he knows that won't happen, but that's the ideal, you know, that it's not something that you contrive and you construct, it just kind of happens. So that idea of chance, I think people are very engaged with. It's a very important late 20th century idea. You know, John Cage threw the I Ching to make his compositions, you know, because he didn't want to express himself, because people always got it wrong anyway, he said. So I wanted to get rid of that idea of expression and actually have a system that allowed the music or the sound to be present. Bacon did exactly that with paint. In the end, it's not about what he's got to say or what he wants to construct as an image. It's actually making the paint present in its own right. And if you find in that presence of the paint a likeness of something or a kind of presence of a human figure or a monstrous figure like this one behind me, that's great. But it's about the paint. And I think a lot of artists really respond to that. And not just painters at all. I mean, we found performance artists, sculptors, video artists, Julie Rapp, you know. You wouldn't expect Julie Rapp necessarily to be influenced by a male painter. But, you know, it's because of the emphasis on the body, on a non-heroic body, I guess. But she's going to talk about what she thinks, so I'll leave that to her. But so a legacy in the sense of people being excited about what he did, but also what he said. Because in the end, through all the champagne bubbles, there's a philosopher speaking to us, which is why we've got so many of these quotes scattered around the gallery and in the catalogue. Because he really did think about the nature of being, about the nature of chaos and control, about consciousness and unconsciousness, the nature of representation itself, actually, what it is to represent something, which is not to illustrate it, but to try and capture its emanation, he said. So all of those thoughts, I think, are very powerful. And that's true of any great artist, I think, that they're trying to do those kinds of things, not by doing it the way he did it. This painting is one study for a triptych, which is in the Tate, which can't travel because it's an early work that was a bit fragile. But it's a very close version to the right-hand panel of that Tate triptych. And what's fascinating about it is that it's the first serious body of painting he did towards the end of the war, which deal with figures at the base of a crucifixion. He's very much inspired by Picasso, not by the painting per se, but by the kind of shape of the figures. Those late bathers that he saw in Paris in 1928, where Picasso met these strange, monstrous women on the beach with these long necks, these strange sort of contorted bodies. And when he saw those, he thought, my goodness, you can do so much to the body and still have the presence of the human figure speak out at you. So he's done that. But in this case, he saw the crucifixion as a subject to do with man's inhumanity to man. He wasn't interested in religion at all. He's a firm atheist. But all the figures in this room, apart from the shower curtain, are to do with the figures at the base of a crucifixion. This one looks like a kind of monstrous creature, half human, half beast, and it's related to the Furies in Greek mythology. And the Furies are sent by the gods to punish the wrongdoers. So if you get a Fury coming into a crucifixion picture, it's about this inhumanity to man that's being punished. In this room also, there are a number of figures that relate to the Magdalene, literally one of the figures at the base of the crucifixion, a figure hunched over with a coat, but they're actually based on his lover Eric Hall's overcoat. But with this one, you can see the gasping for breath. It's always talked about as a scream, but I'd like to actually start to emphasize the fact that Francis Bacon was born with incredibly severe asthma, and in 1992 it killed him, and in between he was gasping for breath. So all these open mouths are a bit more than just a scream taken from art history. I think there's a real visceral sense of ownership of that breath. The painting of the Pope, we've got two of them in the exhibition, but the one we're looking at is based on a painting after Velázquez of Pope Innocent X. It's not literally based on it, and Francis never actually went to see the original, but he had a number of pages torn from, he tore pages out of art history books, okay, naughty man. But they were all over the studio, and there's a crumpled one actually in one of the display cases. So he was using it as a kind of idea. He made up his own color. He got it all wrong, of course, it's nothing like Velázquez. But he was looking at black and white photographs. So, Bacon had a terribly difficult relationship with his father. He was in Germany at the time of the rise of Hitler. He had a whole series of photographs of authority figures, dictators with microphones and so on, which appears in one of the paintings in this room. But I suppose he was interested in creating these figures of power, not necessarily attacking them, not anti-pope necessarily, but quite often his popes are actually screaming or gasping or doing something of the kind. And I think maybe he's punishing the father figure, maybe. This figure of Henrietta Morris, lying figure. Henrietta Morris is a close friend of Francis, and he had John Deacon take a lot of photographs of her, and he painted. She's the only person he ever painted naked, actually, and he painted his lover George Dyer in underpants. That's otherwise as close as he got. But the only woman he painted naked for sure, and I think he used her body quite often in other paintings. But this one was directly taken from a series of photographs that Deacon did, commissioned by Bacon, and actually photo shoot directed by Bacon. And we got some of those photos in the display cases as well. But here she is, lying head towards us, legs splayed away from us. The same pose appears in other pictures in the exhibition, actually, obviously based on her, but not with her name attached to them. But in this one, she's lying on a kind of mattress with stripy ticker, and she's nailed to the bed with a hypodermic syringe, quite clearly. A number of this, there's a series of these paintings of Henrietta Morris, and she's invariably pinned to the bed using this needle. I mean, he said it was nothing to do with drugs, it was just I wanted to nail the figure more firmly to the composition. He's the artist. But, you know, it is, after all, the 60s, and it is a hypodermic syringe. So I think it's a fascinating thing. He was obviously very fond of her. He was very fond of all the people he painted. I mean, he didn't paint strangers. Well, he did once paint Mick Jagger, and it was a disaster, but it's another story. Normally, he would paint very close friends. He might have a photograph lying around, but he would actually remember them. He would try and capture what it felt like to be with them, not what the photograph looked like. So it's a very intimate kind of process, and some of them are very tender, I have to say. Henrietta Morris was a close friend. She was a sort of bohemian part of the art world in Soho in London, and he paints her over and over again. There are several paintings of her in this exhibition. Triptych August 1972 from the Art Gallery. It's probably the first homage to George Dyer painted after his death in 1971. And it probably shows George Dyer on one side and Francis on the other side, and the couple grappling in the middle, presumably is them too. They're sort of dissolving into each other. One of the most fascinating things is the black behind the figures. I mean, you can think of it just as a way of putting black behind the figure to make the figure stand out. But I didn't realize really until looking at it here now just how perfectly he'd painted that black. A lot of the earlier blacks are quite gritty, quite textured or multi-textured in different parts. But here, they're absolutely flat, matte blacks. You know, like a kind of optical painting by Bob Law or something. So there's not a brush mark there. It's completely flat. All you can see is the texture of the canvas underneath, perhaps, that's all. And what that does is to create a void, a kind of space. So you've got this figure, and behind it, a void opening up into infinity. That's not just a doorway, that's infinity. So it's like this is the space into which the presence of George and ultimately Francis is going to disappear. And towards the end of the exhibition, there are all manner of doorways and openings. Sometimes it's not clear whether it's a doorway, a window, or just an opening in the painting itself. It's like cut into the painting, where you get that sense of the void. Actually, I found unexpectedly, even right back at the beginning of the show in the 40s, he was already painting the void. One of the paintings of Eric Hall, where the figure is missing, there's just a black hole where the figure should be, but he's extended that out. You think, what's that about? But you realize it's actually a space where your imagination can fall in, a negation of the body, not just an absence of the body. In this case, you've got something approximating to shadows of the legs on either side. Francis often lets the legs go, actually. Sometimes you think there's a leg there, but when you look again, you find actually it's not actually painted in at all. But the shadows more or less look like slightly pinky sort of fluid seeping out of the body onto the floor, rather than being a shadow. In the earlier paintings, it's often a black shadow, but not after 1960, really. They become colourful events. And right in the middle, there's a shadow, or what appears to be a shadow, which is a kind of ellipse, which is this extraordinary colour, a very bright colour, but it's a geometric shape. It doesn't bear any relation to the figure that might be casting it. Maybe it isn't a shadow at all. I think many of them are not. They are sort of emanations of the body. In this case, maybe just showing you can paint an ellipse, I don't know. But it is an extraordinary painting, and it's one of a whole series after that moment in the exhibition where you find him referring back to George Dyer. Not always with George Dyer's name on it, but George Dyer's hooter. Okay, because once you've spotted George Dyer's profile, you'll spot it everywhere. It's very, very particular. What I really hope that happens when people come in and look at the exhibition is, first of all, if they're still clinging to the idea of illustration, that painting's about making a picture of something, they will change their mind about that. And they will discover that painting figures can be a great deal more than likeness, that it can be paint as flesh, not paint trying to look like flesh, paint in some way creating a sensation in you that brings back the idea of flesh, that sort of thing. I hope they will take away that it's the most complex painting they've ever seen, and that they will agree with me, even if they don't like the images, that this is the greatest painter of the 20th century.